Bore da. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ainsley Bowen. I'll be introducing the session and speakers in Welsh for you this morning. Croeso I cyflwyniad I Pararchive, sesiwn ymieithdio yn amlinellu'r prosiect ymchwil Pararchive. Mynediad agored straeon cymunedol ar archif digidol a leorir ym Mhrifysgol Leeds. Ein prif nod yw creu pecyn cymorth digidol a fydd yn ei gwneud yn haws I bobl I chwilio a defnyddio deunydd a gedwyr mewn archifau cyhoeddus, fel y rhain BBC neu'r amgueddfa wyddoniaeth. Heddiw mae ganddom ni 5 bartneriaid prosiect sydd yn siarad. Os ych chi gen defnyddio trydar, gewch chi trydaru hashtag #ButeStories trwy'r sesiwn.
Thanks, Ainsley. And I'm Dr. Fiona Phillip, and I'm one of the research fellows, along with Dr. Daniel Matibwa, on the Pararchive project. So, following Ainsley of Canna Creative, hello and welcome to Introduction to Pararchive, a breakout session outlining the research project Pararchive Open Access Community Storytelling and the Digital Archive, which is based at the University of Leeds. And our...
As siarad cyntaf yw Simon Pobl, Pararchive's project leader. Fe arweinydd project Pararchive a dibrwy bennaeth y sefydliad astudiaethau cyfarthrebu ym Mhrifysgol Leeds yn dechrau gyda'r cefndir i'r project gan gynnwys sgrinio straeon streic, cyfres o ffilmiau a gynnyrchwyd trwy gydweithrediad blaenorol rhwng Prifysgol Leeds a'r BBC.
So first up, out of our 6 Pararchive project members is Simon Popple, who is Deputy Head of the Institute for Communication Studies at the University of Leeds. And I forgot to say, if you have any Butte stories to share, please use our hashtag #ButeStories, and we're at Pararchive on Twitter.
Thanks, Fiona. It's been an interesting morning already. Fun, wonderful music early on. We had a major burst at the hotel, so Fiona managed to wreck the water system of the entire hotel this morning. We've had a few technical issues as well, losing sound. So hopefully this is going to go smoothly now. So we've had a few worries. So welcome and thank you very much for coming. As Fiona said, my name is Simon Popple. I'm the leader on this Pararchive research project. So I'm going to say a little bit about what the project is, what we're hoping to do. And where the idea for the project came from, and then I'm going to hand over to the connected community groups that we're working with for them to tell you about what they've been doing on the project so far. And then hopefully within a few months of time we're going to come together at the end and take questions. So if you have any questions, we'll take them all at the end, if that's okay with everybody. So I'd like to begin by just saying a little bit about what Pararchive is. It's, if you like, an unknown in terms of what we're actually going to produce and launch next year. It's a project that's developing through connected community co-development, and we're working with a number of community partners to actually design what we envisage as a digital environment that will allow communities, researchers, academics to talk to each other, to tell stories, to develop research projects, so you can do personal history research, or you can do campaigning through community groups, to link groups together and to develop what we've called a parallel archive, a space in which we can locate creative activity and research activity. So what we're doing at the moment is working with groups who you're going to hear from later to develop a specification for this resource that we're going to make. We're looking also at drawing in what's best out there. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're also very aware, and being here this week has made me acutely aware of some areas of duplication or parallel work that's going on with other projects as well. So what we're hoping to create is a one-stop space that everybody can use. It's going to be freeware, it's going to be available for people to take away or use online. We're hoping to launch at the end of March next year at a festival and conference that we're organising. I just thought it'd be useful just to give you some of the key aims of the project. All the information about the project and much more lucid and detailed information about how everything fits together, because it's very complex. It can be found on the Pararchive website. So if you go to pararchive.com, you can read a lot more about the project itself. But what we want to do is firstly to produce a community resource, to give something to communities that can give them capacity to do their own research and to do storytelling, community history, campaigning. We want to explore through this process using action-centered sort of co-design methods. So we're using community technology labs, and we have got technology developers working directly with the communities, developing specifications and examining the needs of those community groups. We're also going to create community research toolkits that people can take away. So one area that we're really interested in at the moment is around using archives, and we're just getting to grips with copyright issues for communities and film clearance. We're working with the BBC as one of our partners on that. So we envisage a number of other resources that will come out of the project. We're looking at issues around ownership and creativity as well. The creative reuse of archival materials, and looking at how we can facilitate that. And again, we're working with a number of organisations, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Alison Hess from the Science Museum a little bit later on, who's going to talk about the Science Museum's involvement in the project. We're also looking at how we can develop relationships between communities, and develop new communities online, communities of interest and affinity. And one of the great things about being here again is just in the space of a day is the number of people that we've met, that we've started to talk to hear about their interests, their research, and thinking about how they could use the tools that we're developing. And so we are sort of doing that even now in this very short time. We're also exploring how we can develop relationships between communities and institutions, because one of the biggest problems, particularly for communities, is getting access to content, getting the authority and permission to do things. So we're working, as I said, with two major institutions, the BBC, BBC Archives and the Science Museum as well, and looking at how their collections and their assets can come into play and how communities can engage with them and use them. So I go to the next slide, great. And so I thought I'd say a little bit about where the idea came from. It came from really a couple of projects that I did around the miners' strike and around the notion of communities and their relationships to cultural assets that depicted their lives and told their stories on their behalf. So I worked with the BBC Archives on a project on the miners' strike called the Open Archive Project, which was looking at how mining communities and also police communities, because they're often forgotten in the dynamic of the strike, could use cultural resources that were held by the BBC to tell their own stories and to engage with stereotyping and misrepresentation as well. So we did a lot of work in terms of working with communities about hearing their stories, showing them materials, and we got funding for a second project on the back of that, thank you, which was called Strike Stories, which was where we tried to realise some of the ideas that they'd had about using content and telling stories on their own behalf. So we got some funding for them to develop what they decided they wanted to make was a series of films that didn't use archival content, but actually responded to it. They wanted to fill in the gaps in the archive, to put their voice into the archive alongside the sort of editorial voice of the BBC. So we produced a series of films which are online. If you Google Strike Stories, you'll find them. And what came out of that project was a sense that everybody you talked to had profound sort of anxieties about the way in which their stories were taken away from them and told on their behalf. And what we wanted to do was to, in a very limited sense, allow them to tell those stories or to tell those missing stories. So I wanted to show you a very brief extract from one of the films, just to give you a sense of what we were doing.
Orgreave, Maltby, mass picket, police violence, picket violence, actually being stopped from travelling. Didn't matter where you tried to get to, police were blocking your way.
Long hours, sense of comradeship, an unspoken, undocumented camaraderie as well between a lot of the guys who were on the picket lines and the bobbies that were actually policing them. And that when it wasn't the 5 minutes of mayhem, conversations were held, there was banter, there was humour, running right through the whole lot. There's no question about that.
I've never known whole communities gather together and be friends and look after each other as they did then. But at that time, we were still in an era when people looked after each other.
Fun times, to some extent, and I think a lot of people who were actively involved, the strike will probably say the same, most intense year ever.
Distress it caused to both the miners and the rest of the police force and the general public. It really did cause some distress right across the country.
Truthfully, it was the best year of my life, the strike was. The weather was fantastic. I didn't go to work 7 days a week. I went to London, I met Londoners, Southerners, things like that. I had a great time. I'm an electrician by trade at Frickley Colliery, and I went picketing with fellow electricians, so we're a team that worked together, in my opinion, battling together, you know what I mean? So I went down London, I met the most fantastic people that supported us, which I'd always heard of this north-south divide. I know that's a total lie, a myth.
I was at Augury for quite a while, and I mean the bricks and bottles and stones thrown at you, and you know, trying to arrest people or fighting with people, but those sorts of things, you know, because it's your, that's what you do mostly in the job anyway, in the police. So you forget about those sort of things, the violence, etc. And the memories of some of the laughs that I had with either the miners or other police officers, and some of the jokes that used to come out, and some of the things that used to happen that made you laugh.
The fun. Had loads and loads of fun during the strike. The sense of freedom about being released from work and not having to do the 9 to 5, that was great. And I love the freedom of being out and about and being unaccountable and nobody knowing where I was. So yeah, loads and loads of fun and high octane optimism and excitement, and it's something that lives with me now.
So that just gives you a flavour of what we were doing there. And the idea really for the project came out of my experience of working on that project and working with different community groups. So the project developed as an idea through the Creative Technology Lab that was run at Leeds University, and I was actually partnered with a group of technology developers, one of whom is here today, Imran, and we came up with the concept and tried to think about how we could make this sort of ability to let people have access to resources and to do sort of cultural production in open space, and to make freeware tools that everybody could use. So, if you can have the next slide please, Fiona, thanks. So there's just a very simple map of the networks of people that we're working with at the moment. We've got, as I said, a group of technology developers, Carbon Imagineering, who Imran's going to talk about later. We've got 2 major institutional partners, BBC Archives and the Science Museum, and then 4 community partners as well. So we've got Brandon Archaeology, Ceramic Stories, City Stories Stoke, Bocchier, Manchester, and Arduino, Manchester. And you're going to hear from some of those groups over the next sort of half an hour or so about the work that they've been doing and their engagement with the project. And Bocchier and Arduino have got installations through their parent organisation, MadLab, at Motorpoint, and also downstairs. If you've seen the laser harp, you'll find the right stall. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Alison Hess from the Science Museum, who's going to talk about the Science Museum's involvement.
Great, thanks Simon. Yeah, as Simon's just been saying, we are one of the major institutional partners on the Pararchive project. So I just thought I'd use this few minutes here to talk a little bit about the museum, and about the collections, and about some of the issues that have been raised in being involved in this project. So we hold over 300,000 objects, and which has with particular strengths in Western science, technology and medicine since 1700. but actually that's only a sort of small sort of summary of what we have. We have a major site in South Kensington where we display just a small proportion of this collection, with most of it unfortunately still in storage. And we hold everything from sort of the iconic objects such as Stephenson's rocket, which I'm not sure if you can see in the bottom corner, right through to the sort of everyday kind of collections such as sort of refrigerators and locks and all sorts of different things. And actually, can I get the next slide? And so this slide is just sort of to show sort of the sort of variety of the kind of things we have. It is actually huge amounts more. I'm actually hoping to show as well with this the kind of like categories we use, which aren't always, I guess, as obvious as as you might think. But this is only kind of on the ways into our collections. As I was saying, most of our collections are actually on display. Most of them are in storerooms like this, hidden away in, these are pictures of our small object stores in Blythe House in Kensington. And we have another storeroom out near Swindon, which is on an old aircraft site in sort of various hangars. And that holds things like sort of cars and trains and all sorts of exciting things. And actually these storerooms hold about sort of 80% of our collections. And they're very, very different from the kind of public spaces of the museum, which are sort of heavily mediated, have sort of layers of interpretation and labels. In here, as some of my colleagues here know, there aren't any labels. Everything's on sort of shelves, and it's very much sort of just sort of wandering around through the history of the museum and the history of technology. Every object does have a label, which does sort of provide you some clues. And I've been sort of, through this project, thinking a bit more about the sort of strategies that we use to sort of find ways into this. And if I get my next one. For me, there are kind of two ways. I mean, the first one is always to go and talk to my colleagues. There is sort of a wealth of knowledge in our curators' heads. But they are very sort of time pressured and they don't always have the time to sort of find things for me. So my other way in is through, I thought I'd show you what our object database looks like. This is a bit of a clunky system sometimes, and I've sort of given you a record which is particularly good. But I mentioned object numbers, so every object in those storerooms has a number, and you can see it there at the top. And that's a way of finding something when you know what you're looking for, which you don't always. And in this case, we've got a nice description, we've got what collection it's in, we've got who made it, and we've got when it was made. And unfortunately, not every object has such a good record. So those are kind of my ways in, I guess. And it was sort of thinking about these ways in that I was kind of coming to this project. So yeah, that was actually my very first challenge, was how you sort of create a route into this. If you think back to the previous slide, with all the sort of the shelves and shelves of objects, and those are only 2 rooms, it's sort of room after room, and some are huge, some are tiny, some are sort of hundreds of objects and drawers. How you start to introduce someone to that. And I think we've had some conversations with my colleagues here, and I'm hoping they'll sort of comment on it as well, about how where we start with that. And I think some of the groups must be looking at us and saying, what on earth in your collection? And I go, well, where do I start? And I'm looking at them and saying, so what are you interested in? And so we've been going backwards and forwards like that for a little while, I think. So my next challenge, I guess was linking to that, is how you sort of bring people into the storerooms or into the sort of on-display collections. And I'm thinking particularly about geography here. All our collections are sort of in London or in Broughton. And how do you take something so big and take it to somewhere in another part of the country? I mean, I've sort of been printing out pictures and showing people examples from the archive, but they're not enough in a way to sort of, I guess, kind of get that sort of serendipitous relationship with some of the things in our collection, which you get when you wander around and you think, oh wow, I had one of those, or my mum had one of those, or my grandmother had one of those. Which kind of, I guess, takes me on to my next thing I've been thinking about. I mean, we have actually got large sort of 2D collections, amazing archives, which I can kind of imagine fitting in with the sort of the digital project we've been thinking about. But we've got 3D materials, and some of those are the most exciting parts. And I'm wondering how, I don't have an answer to this, how we capture that and incorporate it into something like a digital storytelling platform. I mean, the Science Museum did recently release an app which had some amazing photography in it, sort of 3D rotating thing which linked you in with some of the information and video and stuff. But I know that was very time consuming, and I'm not sure we could do that for everything, but it's definitely something I'm thinking about at the moment. The last one is slightly less exciting, but still very important. The issues of copyright and permissions. I think this is something that our other partners at BBC were thinking about as well. About sort of who owns our collections, and obviously they're nationally owned, and that we care for them on behalf of the nation. But it's much more complicated than that, and I think there is still a nervousness within the museum to sort of open those collections out and give other people kind of an opportunity to present them in different ways. And actually, there's the more sort of straightforward copyright issues. I mean, with photography, I hadn't realised that actually photographers who took the pictures may still have copyright rights over the images. So even though they're in a collection, we may still have to go back and work out whether they own the rights and things like that. So that's been a very sort of windy route, and I'm still sort of very much learning about how that might work out. Yeah. So my last kind of slide are just some things I've been thinking about with this project, and some things I've been thinking about generally as I've been wandering around the festival yesterday and this morning. And I'm sort of going to leave them hanging there, maybe for a bit of a discussion later. Because I'm constantly thinking about what the value of these collections are, of the collections that aren't on the museum floor, and some collections which may never be on the museum floor are. And then part of the solution, I think, is probably creating better access to them. But thinking about some of my challenges which have come up from this project, how should that be facilitated? And finally, the big one, what role does digital have to play? And I'm hoping we can sort of work through some of the questions through discussing Pararchive project. So I think that's all from me, really.
Diolch yn fawr, Alison. Diddorol iawn. Fe fydd y siaradwr nesaf, Paul Duffy, cyfarwyddwr Blandania, archeolog a thrafdiadaeth. Bute yn dad o'r chwilio straeon newydd a rei rhwng Bute a Butetown, ac yn chwilio o'i diwylliannau a'i tirweddau cysylltiedig.
So next up we have Paul Duffy, Director of Brandanii Archaeology and Heritage Bute. And I said it right, I think.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you did manage to say Brandania, right? Which is very good. That's the organisation that I run, the Bute. And really what I wanted to do today with this little slot is to give you an idea of our journey and our experiences of working as part of the Pararchive project. Effectively, I function as the community facilitator, I think would be the technical term that we've come up with in the pub over the last couple of days for what we do. So, and working with the local community and working with people in that, we are telling digital stories and using Pararchive to try and tell our digital stories about Bute. A bit of background about Bute. If I haven't grabbed you to already say what a fantastic island it is and how everybody should visit on their holidays, then I'm saying that now, so please come and visit us. It's situated 45 minutes from Glasgow by train and a 35-minute ferry ride. So having spent a bit of time in the southeast of England, the commute from Glasgow to Butte that my partner does is significantly less than the commute that some people have to go into London. So just if you're thinking of relocating as well, we have when I started this, the other thing I was going to say quickly is that I tend to talk quite a lot, so could you give me a nudge if we get to about 45 minutes? When I started this, when I had the invitation to come down and talk, which we're very, very grateful for, to come down and show off some of our stuff. I looked at a map of Cardiff and we got the programme through, and I suddenly realised that we were going to be in Butte Town in Cardiff, which to be honest is a complete gift in terms of a kind of tagline to hang this talk off. So what I wanted to do was kind of talk about our journey, our collective journey as the Butte Research Collective from Butte to Butte Town. And journeys, of course, being one way of telling a story, one kind of thread of a story in that sort of way. So in terms of our digital stories that we're trying to tell, then hopefully this is, in a way, a bit of a digital story that tells you about where we're going. So our involvement really started in 2008 to 2012. We had a landscape partnership scheme on Butte funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. I was the project manager for the archaeology for that scheme. And effectively we spent 4 years auditing the archaeology of Butte, enhancing that knowledge, enhancing that audit through excavations, through survey, through documentary research, through working with archives, and really trying to excite people about the archaeology and the heritage of the island. And that was people coming from off the island and also people on the island itself, to give the community back some resilience, I suppose, and some understanding of what they see around about them every day. One of the key things, as part of the Heritage Lottery Fund project, one of the key things about that was this idea of legacy and what's left in terms of legacy. Some of those buzzwords that were in the project documentation about upskilling, about knowledge transfer, knowledge enhancement, about giving people new opportunities and new ways of learning, I actually took very seriously. And because I think the 4-year investment that Heritage Lottery Fund made as part of that project is really just the beginning of what we can do and what we should be doing with these sort of projects. So I took that seriously, and just as the project was starting to come to an end, we started looking at new things to do. One of the things we produced was a research framework about the island. So we'd worked with the academic community in Scotland, and we'd also worked with the local community. And over 2 years we produced a thematic research framework, basically, which had 6 key themes identified that people were interested in collectively. And that collective had decided one of the key themes that they were interested in was looking at the archaeology and heritage of farming. So we started looking at different ways that we could do projects related to the archaeology and heritage of farming. And roughly about that time, got the invitation from Simon to come on and see whether we could get involved in the Pararchive project. So the Pararchive project really fitted in fantastically for us because there was an interest and bits and pieces of work that were already starting, but we had no way really of telling the stories that we were starting to produce from it. And the Pararchive project really offered us a fantastic opportunity to look at new ways of telling that story. And I say new ways as the talk develops, because a large percentage of the people that we work with on a regular basis as part of our research collective are retired people, are kind of older people, are people who are perhaps, to use that kind of Saatchi phrase, are kind of technology immigrants rather than technology natives in that sort of way. So it's people to whom the digital environment isn't necessarily a first choice. The choice is really much more traditionally map-based, like the example that I've shown here. It's documentary-based, it's book-based. And within that understanding is also the understanding that people have of what the authority of narrative is, who's got the authority in the narrative. And people were very, very used to having the authority of narrative coming from the sources they were looking at, in particular documents, or in particular papers, in particular somebody standing up who's from a university, for example, and talking to people and saying these are the facts. So this was some of the things that we had at the start, and some of the things that Pararchive have helped us explore. We're also doing a little survey of the farms, so we're trying to understand the stories about some of the farming things, and this is just a little picture of some of the people who are working on the project as part of the kind of research collective, doing some of the survey work as well. And Sue Hothersall has also come all the way down from Butte to here as well, to keep me company and keep me out of trouble or get me into trouble, I'm not sure whether. So back to the next slide. So part of our farming inquiry, if you like, is based around trying to understand the built heritage, the built environment of farming, and this is one of the key things. I put this slide up as an example of some of those things that we are trying to understand, that the Pararchive is helping us understand. Effectively what you see in this slide on the left hand side is an improvement period byre effectively for cattle. Now that improvement period byre was built around about the 1820s, and would have housed the herd basically for the farm, which was a dairy producing farm. So that herd would probably be about 30 cows, 40 cows, that sort of scale of production at this particular farm, although herds kind of varied a little bit in size, because most of them are a wee bit smaller. The building on the right is a new shed that was produced, a new milking parlour that was built, and we don't actually know the exact date of this, but we think it was sometime around about the 1950s, 1960s this was built. This was built in response to the Milk Marketing Board's drive for increased milk production in Britain. So effectively it was a national push, if you like, the Milk Marketing Board undertook in terms of have your daily pint or drink a pint of milk, but also in terms of the farms, to say to the farmers, we have to start increasing production of this. Okay. Now the response from the farms and from the farmers was basically to try and increase the chances they have for productivity. They build bigger space, they build bigger premises basically to house bigger herds. That knowledge, if you like, in terms of the specifics of those dialogues that existed with the Milk Marketing Board and what they were doing as a community are kind of lost us. But through the Pararchive project, one of the interesting things that we've discovered is that the National Science Museum actually has a large collection of material that basically relates directly to the Milk Marketing Board and some of the decisions made, as well as posters and bits and pieces that they do as well. So already in terms of our community and how our community researches, we had a direct link in terms of being able to say, well, here's the stuff, here's the actual documentation that relates directly to this building on our island. So we started to build connections that way, and we started to build our expanded knowledge, if you like, and looking at how we could do that. One of the other things that was quite good for this is that the Scottish Green Archive also have some archive footage, and we're talking to them at the moment, but have some archive footage of some of the Milk Marketing Board adverts and bits and pieces of, bits and pieces of the ephemera, the film ephemera associated with the Milk Marketing Board. And it would be quite interesting as a digital resource as well. We're talking then to see if we can use it to help tell the story of buildings like this. Because ultimately this is the story of a lot of farming in Bute, and why we wanted to do farming in Bute, because after that Milk Marketing Board push, after a lot of the farmers put themselves into significant halt basically to build new buildings, we joined the EEC. And the EEC effectively had a completely different strategy for farmers and for farming and for dairy, which basically said, you've got a quota. You can produce as much as you want, but we're only going to take 70% of what you've got. And that 30% of milk that went down the drain as a result of those decisions that were made in the early 70s was the farmer's profit to pay back his loan for these farms. So the farming landscape that we see today in Bute is very much decimated. We've lost 3/4 of our dairy farms since 1980. And some of the direct reasons from that, you can read in the buildings, and you can understand those stories through some of the Pararchive stuff that we're doing as well. So this is a lot of fun. It's a great research story for us, but for us as an island, as a community, there are some very real issues that we're starting to untease through working with the Pararchive project. We're also starting to pick up some of the kind of more, the more personal kind of bits and pieces associated with farming, and seeing if we can understand some of the stories behind this. This is just this is one of the farms, and this is a little chalkboard that the farmer had for marking up how many cows he had, what the bull was doing, I'll leave the rest to your imagination. But it's quite interesting in terms of picking up those individual kind of personal bits as well, and seeing how we can turn them into stories as well. One of the things that we started doing, click on this. If the film works. One of the things we started doing was starting thinking in terms of the project a bit, not just about how we're capturing things through traditional media, like I said, drawing and photographs, but also starting to use digital resources ourselves to understand how the resource could happen. And again, the Pararchive project, dealing with digital media, has been a big way for us to start to use that and to push that to understand things. So this is the same two buildings that I showed you a photograph of, but already you can see kind of the difference that a bit of film makes in terms of understanding what those buildings are and what they're about. And by thinking about how we can put things into the Pararchive, for our own Pararchive, to tell the stories, then increasing use of digital stuff is something that we're trying to do and we're trying to develop. And it's a very nice way of being able to do it by doing it in the structure of a project. Also, as I said, in terms of that kind of those digital artifacts, as we're starting to call them, and the artifacts that we can use, obviously, the Science Museum has a great online resource. I've nicked this, there's no copyright issues because this is educational. But we're starting to understand, kind of again, some of the ephemera, some of the bits and pieces that you pick up that are associated with the stories that we're starting to tell. an empty milk carton, this is an English milk carton, but an empty milk carton in itself is part of that story and helps to tell part of that story. These are artefacts that we can use to illustrate some of the things that we want to illustrate as well. And we're starting to explore, as I said, with the Science Museum in terms of how we create that digitally and what those digital artefacts can be as part of our stories as well. As I said as well, we're also starting to look at Scottish Screen Archive and understand stuff about the Scottish Screen Archive. If you click it, this might get very complicated. Yeah, or just anywhere. Let's hope the Wi-Fi works. Scottish Screen Archive's got a fantastic archive of films related to Scotland. Quite a large percentage of them are farming, like I said. And again, as a research community, to be able to understand some of the stuff that we're looking at in terms of farming, how farming practice works, what's actually happening with the buildings that we can see, or similar buildings to the buildings we can see, then it's another fantastic digital resource as well. And again, another way, another thing, potentially another artefact for us potentially as a group to pull in to help tell the story or to help illustrate to people what our story's about. In fact, very much this is illustrating what I'm trying to talk about to you today as a digital medium as well. So, thank you. So yeah, so yeah, as part of this, we're starting to explore the digital media stuff and start to look at things. And we're also starting to as a research group, as a research collective, to become much more familiar and comfortable with the digital. So again, it was a bit of I think you'd agree probably, Sue, for a lot of people, it was a bit of an alien landscape to start navigating in terms of telling stories. And also the very nature of the Pararchive project itself, as at the start, as Simon said at the start, we weren't quite sure what it was going to be. It's a voyage of discovery, effectively, in terms of how we're going to tell these stories and what's going to happen. So, in trying to understand that, it was also a very good cue for me to be able to introduce some of these digital resources and telling digital story, and using digital resources for telling stories to the community as well, and getting people interested in thinking about what's actually out there that can be used to give information to us, but also how we can put information back out from our community back out to the wider world as well. And I mean, I think in terms of networks and in terms of connections, then that's been one of the big pluses for me so far as a facilitator, is that I now have a research group and we've got to a very good level in terms of traditional research understanding, and we're now taking that next step together with the Pararchive project as kind of a cuddly framework roundabout, is to help us in terms of saying, well, what are these digital resources that we can use, but also we can put stuff back out and into the world about it as well. So this was one of our early digital workshops that we did. So it was reassuringly comfortable actually to come to one of the early workshops as part of the design process that Imran and his team are kind of sorting out at the moment, to see that there wasn't any laptops, there weren't any tablets, there wasn't even a smartphone, I think, on the table. There was effectively there was some post-it notes and a few index cards as well. But this kind of really helped us in terms of starting to, this is where we are at the moment, this is kind of the cutting edge, if you like, of our project, and that we're now starting to understand what stories we've got, and we've got 3 stories we want to tell at the moment. We've got one about the history of milk on Butte, from the very earliest kind of back closest where cows were kept and milk was distributed to your neighbours, right the way through to the story of the EEC and kind of the milk that was distributed as part of an EEC network. We've got a story we want to tell about superstition as well, and how superstition affects rural communities and affects farming communities as well, so we're starting to work through that. And we've got a story about women on the island and women in farming, and what the role of women in farming is, and in fact who the big players were in that story of the island. You know, and that's particularly interesting, I think, because there's a gap in terms of that has been a traditional thing, certainly from our experience, in terms of being able to say, well, women quite often had a big presence, and some of the best show cattle on the island in the past 50 or 60 years were produced by farmers that were women who'd been widowed and basically continued on farming. So there's a really interesting bit as part of that story. So we're trying to tell these 3 stories, and we're breaking it down effectively into our blocks, and then trying to understand what we can use to illustrate those blocks of the story, those bits of the story, which is where all the post-it notes and the tickers coming round about it. The slide wasn't big enough to show a couple of them at the bottom, which start disappearing off the screen, because when you start to get into these stories and start looking for the digital resources that might be there, that we might be able to help tell the story with, and people really start getting that and being playful with it and start experimenting with it and thinking, you know, what can I use to illustrate this bit about a milk cart? How can I show that online and see what I can do? Then the potentials for that really start developing and enhancing quite substantially. So, So this is where we are at the moment. One of the other things I think that's worth saying as part of this is that our research group, our research collective, as well as connecting, I suppose, through this to all the other groups that are involved in the Pararchive, and to you people that are here today, and people that I've talked to in this conference as well, it's also helped us form very strong connections internally. As a research group, it's also helped us to really reinforce some of the things that we're doing, because we found as part of the process that actually the process of getting together and discussing individual research projects has become a interconnected brainstorming session, effectively, where somebody might bring to the table something that they've found as part of a story, to find that somebody else is kind of butting in and saying, that's very interesting, you found that, because I've got a photograph that shows exactly what you're talking about, or I saw something online the other day that is exactly represents what you're saying as well. So it's also, so the community, if you like, and the connection and the digital interfaces, the wide world. But I don't think we can forget, for community groups like mine, I don't think we forget that projects like this also have a very real sense in terms of helping us to develop as a collective group and helping us to develop our research skill. And I think we've got to a stage now where, I mean, these things remains fun. The workshops that we do as part of the Pararchive stuff remains fun, and the bits and pieces that we do in between those things in terms of developing our own stories are really good fun, but they're also very research strong. There's a lot of strength, and when you consider the majority of people that work in it had no real practical experience in terms of you know, full-on research in that sort of way, I think it's helped us come a long way as a community as well. So thinking about those communities, as part of what I wanted to do for this as well was just I thought before I came down it was quite interesting, because obviously if we're talking about digital and we're talking about communities, I'm not a great Twitter user, but I'm intrigued by the possibilities of forming communities online with Twitter to start exploring some issues and start exploring some stories. So one of the things that I suggested that we did and we wanted to do was run this hashtag Butte Stories thing. And this is quite simply a few tweets that I've put out, which is pictures of things that I've seen wandering about here. Obviously, Butte Town is Butte Town because the Marquis of Butte effectively married into the family that owned most of South Wales. There were landowners that owned most of South Wales. They started extracting the coal. They built Butte docks, built the docks, as most people know, and effectively that's where the family fortune was based. The whole of the Buttes, as a family, a large proportion of their modern income basically is based on coal mining in Cardiff. So there are all these fantastic connections. So I've been tweeting a few bits and pieces about that. As an example, we had, in fact, if you go to the next slide, thank you. One more of this. The Mount Stewart is kind of a commonly recurring theme. An example of one of those things that I managed to find as we were walking past. If anybody's been to the Witherspoons pub that's in Butte Town, it's called the Mount Stewart. Okay, so there was a little tweet that went out. Mount Stewart being reimagined and turned into Witherspoons pub, which Mount Stewart and Butte, which is a large stately home, which is the seat of the Butte, absolutely loved. They thought it was fantastic and that. But there's real connections developing between there and here in quite unusual and strange ways. So, and this is in fact Mount Stewart House on the left-hand side. So this is the seat of the Butte family. But I was also struck with some of the connections with some of the architecture of Butte Town as well. And I hope you can see, it might just be me making this up, but I hope you can see I think there's quite strong similarities in terms of the architecture and the proportions between Butte House on your left-hand side and between the Pierhead building on the right-hand side. And at the moment what I'm doing is trying to use Twitter to explore what that is and what the story behind it is as well. So if anyone's got any ideas, please, hashtag Butte Stories. Thank you for listening. I hope that was 15 minutes.
Diolch yn fawr. Nesaf fydd Danny Callahan a Jane Wells o prosiect straeon dinas seramig llwybr Crochendau Tiles, Stoke-on-Trent yn cynnig blas ar un o'n prosiectau ymchwil cymunedol Pararchive.
And next up we have Danny Callahan and Jane Wells from Ceramic City Stories based in Stoke-on-Trent.
Having to follow the cultural attaché for Butte, the cultural attaché from Stoke-on-Trent. I'm allowed to say that because it's my home city. I'm going to do it slightly differently to the fab presentation that Paul just gave. It's all about stories, how you research them, how you create them, how you share them. Maybe all those things mixed up, not necessarily in a linear way. A few people in the audience have just got 3 tiles. 3 tiles that were made in Stoke-on-Trent about 150 years ago. by Minton & Co. On the top you'll see beautiful encaustic or inlaid tiles. Very interestingly, picking up the shared stories theme, those tiles were actually repatriated from Palace of Westminster. So Victoria, Churchill, Disraeli, just kind of literally walked on my city's creative products. And you turn them over, which some people are already doing. It's the city of turner-overers. That's the potteries, Stoke-on-Trent. You'll always know, the turning crocker. Somebody I met earlier from Staffordshire saying it's steelite. All the crockery here is steelite from Bursley. So this is what's very interesting. These are Puget mint tiles. Maybe what's really nice is to have a piece of the city's industrial history, ceramic industry in your hands. And these are props. We had a fantastic project called the Potteries Tile Trail, which was a crowdsourced virtual collection of tiles and architectural ceramics to be found across the city of Stoke, but also in a different but similar way to some of the things Paul's touching on. We use social media. We have a very, very successful @Potteries Tiles Twitter account. It's been a phenomenal conversation that we've been having with people from across the world. So there's pieces of Stoke-on-Trent historical ceramics to be found in Sydney, in Old Bombay, in middle of Central Park, New York. So it's fantastic, amazing, unbelievable exchange. Almost on a daily basis we will have an exchange with people saying, is this Stoke-on-Trent ceramics? I found this, etc., etc. So it's Empire Shipping Line stuff, which lovely connections. One of the other shared stories that happened immediately when Simon and the Pararchive team went to Butte, Rothsay, stopped in Rothsay where the ferry pulls in. We went in beautiful, beautiful Victorian toilets. Where was the ceramics made? Yeah, it's Twyford's from Stoke-on-Trent. So straight away there's a hyper-local to hyper-local connection. And real beautiful things. Within seconds Simon has tweeted that over to me as a picture, and we then put it onto the collection that we made in a DIY way using History Pin. So that was the backstop project that was going on when I first met Simon, and had the fantastic opportunity to be part of the Pararchive project. We gathered, what was interesting about, again, following on some of Paul's themes, we were looking for some, we were looking for what happens next with the Potteries Tile Trail project. And I think for us, the Pararchive project was perfect timing as well. It enables some of the people that were involved in that original project to continue to work together as a research team and to continue to uncover ceramic stories, ceramic city stories. And we pulled together new researchers and decided to create a little sort of sub-identity for the team, with a view to what happens next after Pararchive, which I hope will continue in different guises as well. So there's a self-contained identity. I won't tell you all the detail about what we've been doing and the various researchers have been doing. If you hopefully have picked up one of the cards that are on the table. So these have got a website address on, which is it's a sub-project address site to the wonderful Pararchive site, but it will give you a much more detailed idea of the research process that's been going on in Stoke, the learning journey, which has been phenomenal, working with people like Imran and thinking about how we can DIY our archive. That's been a major learning journey from our point of view. We've been using, I mentioned History Pin, which is a fantastic, if you don't know it, have a look for it. There's links on the Ceramic City Stories site to this. And the Potteries Tile Collection. Potteries Tile Trail is a 300 strong collection on there, but it's a free to use digital archive with geolocation, with photographs and other media. We've used Evernote, which for some of you may have come across, but it's a really amazing, very deceptively simple digital online cloud-based archive system. And all of these things have been provoked by this fantastic learning journey that we've had the privilege to be involved with. So all those links are in there. You'll find out in much more detail about our learning journey as a team. And more importantly, if you like, you'll find out about some of the specific stories that the individual researchers are actually delivering. And these cards, as well as having the little project address on the back, these represent some of those stories. One of those people who's involved in that research team is colleague Jane Wells, and if Jane would like to just come up and tell her story, please, her ceramic city story.
Hello. My story, I don't know if anybody's got this card, it's a photograph of a lady. This is my mum. And I'm researching the years that my mum spent in Longton, which is one of the, if you for those 6 towns that make up the Potteries. And my mum's family were evacuated from London. Their house was bombed, and they had a relative in Longton, and they came to stay with her, Auntie Florrie, and that was in 1941. And from then they sort of found their own house, and my mum stayed in the Potteries until the early 1950s when she left to do a nurse's training. But after leaving school, she spent 2 years working in a factory called Ainsley's in Longton. And so I'm researching the years that Mum spent in the Potteries, but with a specific focus on the time she spent working in the pottery factory, and she's trained to be a lithographer. Now, my starting point was just to find out what did we know already as a family. So I started by talking to my mum's surviving sisters, Maureen and Beth, and they were younger than my mum, so their memories are sort of hazy, but it was a fantastic starting point for me. And I looked through family photograph albums and a handful of photographs of my mum from that time. The next thing that I did was to contact my mum's school, and coincidentally they had just begun archiving all their school records, which I think date back from 1818, which is incredibly early. So my contact at the school, St Gregory's School, sent me sort of via email scanned photographs of school logbooks and the school register that sort of the entries of when my mum started school and the infants, and then when she left in the senior school. But he also sent me copies, sort of scanned images of the head teacher's logbook, which it's a day-to-day diary really of some of the school trips that my mum might have gone on, commemorative events like coronations and sort of the end of the war, and sort of trips out to Trenton Gardens, and I know my mum would have been on all those trips. The photograph here actually is a works trip to London that my mum went on in 1950, I think it was. And she's standing in Trafalgar Square, and I've been back and had a photograph of myself standing in the very same place, which is a bit cheesy, but it was actually really quite difficult to find the exact spot. And there's the fourth plinth is behind my mum, and now it's got an electric blue cockerel on the top, so the photographs aren't quite the same. I've looked at photographic archives, Staffordshire Past Track, for sort of images of Longton at the time in the factory, and film archive as well, in a similar way to sort of Paul's group used for moving image of Longton at the time. And also similarly to Paul, what's been really sort of vital and interesting sort of part of the project is working with the other members of the team, the other community researchers. We meet up probably once a month, I think, and we just sort of tell everybody what we've done over the sort of since we last met. But everybody then kind of pitches in and sort of says, have you thought of doing this, or have you thought of looking there? And I said earlier that my mum was trained to be a lithographer, and one of the other community researchers worked as a lithographer, so she's been able to tell me exactly what the job entails and what the training would have involved. So it was we're a very sort of supportive group. I don't know what else to say, really. But it's a wonderful project to be involved in. I'm doing it for myself, but I'm sort of doing it for the family as well, so that I can pass this on to my children, my mum's grandchildren, and my sisters, so that, you know, it's about our past. It's a sort of wonderful thing to be involved in, but you do get kind of sidetracked, and you end up kind of going off in one direction, having to rein yourself back in again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And all of that story, Jane's story, and some of the links that form part of the story blocks and some of the pilot work that we're doing with Imran and the tech team can be found on Ceramic City Stories. So you'll find all of the 6 stories for 6 towns, which is 6 towns of the federated city of Stoke-on-Trent. Thank you very much, Jane, for that. I think probably just time-wise, just very, very quickly, two final sort of comments from our point of view. For probably 10, 15 years now, what would you say, it was a creative facilitator or something?
Something like that, yeah.
Whatever. There's not a tax classification. Not that we make enough money to fill out a tax form, but I've been sort of trying to deal with archive material and creating archive material, as we've heard some of Jane's stories about accessing archive material, which of course is a major part of what the wider project's about. How do you organise the stuff? You know, Jane, as an example, like most people, physical files, ring binder files with photocopies, some virtual stuff in physical form, like on DVDs or on memory sticks, some on computer files, electronic files, digital files on her computer, some exchanges and communications and email, disparate stuff. So that's where we've got to Evernote at the moment as the best DIY solution to harvesting stuff and creating our own digital archives. And that's something else you'll find when you click around the site. You'll find examples of where people have kindly let us publish online their Evernote digital archives with the stuff that they've started to gather. We want to then use this project as a way of then interfacing with how you share those stories in a bigger way, whether it's with us through social media particularly, or particularly with those kinds of a more effective way of telling those stories. I guess going back to the beginning with some of the strike story, the quality of some of those stories that are in the presentation. So I think it's something about how you then open that up. Final thought, sorry. So it develops, it's certainly Pararchive is absolutely developing an individual professional theme around archiving and sharing in relation to research for me. It's also developing Ceramic City Stories, which really have their root for me back into personal research about the history of ceramics and where they've gone around the globe, where you find them under your nose in the city and absolutely everywhere else, and how that's a common currency for making connections and contemporary relationships using that language, if you like. So it's really exciting that we've got this sort of future-facing opportunity to kind of harvest all of this massive stuff that I think a lot of people in the city have been working on, a lot of people without the city have been working on for decades. How do you create this virtual institution, for want of a better term, with this digital archive of personal research and personal knowledge, and how can that be shared and benefit? There's this massive resource that for me is not accessible by one another, and it's not out there in the wider world with all of these shared stories. So that's enough of me babbling on, but thank you very much, folks. Please have a look at the website. Actually, sorry, one last thing. Could I have the tiles back? Because they're probably worth about £4 a piece.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Jane.
Diolch yn fawr, Danny, Jane. Ein siaradwr olaf ni heddiw yw Imran Ali, partner sefydlol o Carbon Imagineering. Ein partner technoleg yn trafod gyd-gynllunio a chyd-datblygiadau parhaus o adnodd digidol Pararchive.
Our final partner to talk is Imran Ali, who is founding member, one of the founding members of Carbon Imagineering. So we've got about 15 minutes left before we have to vacate the room. So if we don't have time for questions, there's quite a few Pararchive members around for the rest of the day, so please do approach us and ask in the breaks. Okay, Imran.
I think I'm one
yeah, sorry.
Hi, my name is Imran Ali. I'm one of the founders of Carbon Imagineering, as Fiona pointed out. We're a digital R&D practice, and much of our work is understanding the impact of emerging technologies and synthesising new opportunities from them, largely around kind of innovations that we see as being quite disruptive. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I thought I'd reflect on the design approach to Pararchive.
Sorry, can you come forward a bit, because you're...
Right, FYI. How's that? Is that better? Okay. So I thought I'll reflect on the design approach that we've taken and talk a little bit about the challenges that we've had, reflect a little bit on the tools and processes and methodologies we've used. And it's a good time for us to think about that and talk about it publicly as we're kind of moving more into the implementation and development side of the project. Next slide, thanks. So back in autumn 2012, Simon and I first met as part of a matchmaking programme that brought together academics and technologists as a kind of speed dating exercise, I guess, or slow dating actually. So over the course of 4 caffeine and cake-fueled days, we deliberated and ideated on storytelling, memory, archives, journalism, personal collections, and where we thought technology was disrupting all these areas, but also opening opportunities to really create some interesting innovations too. So from these conversations we created a concept that we call Pararchive, a name that I will forever be embarrassed to be involved in creating. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It was one of our guys that came up with it, but I apologise. But essentially it was an app for exploring stories around the London riots of 2011. And it brought together social media, open data, personal perspectives, and large institutional media archives. Next slide, thanks. And more importantly than a design, it actually helped us surface a few key principles that would guide the larger research project, which is what we've all been talking about today. We wanted to seek to create a neutral space, focusing on narrative rather than truth and veracity, and something that allowed us to orchestrate pieces of media from wherever they might come up, whether that's respected sources and institutions or personal collections. But the metaphor that we always kind of worked with was a kind of fabric or tapestry of connecting stories that can be quite small or quite big, fictional, non-fictional, but together actually represented something that was much greater than some of its parts. Next slide, thanks. By this point, we'd only used fictional personas that we created ourselves, and it was time to really begin to work with real people and real stories. And that's where our relationship with the university has been really powerful, as they've recruited communities that represented really interesting diversity. But also, there's a kind of, we were talking about this earlier, Paul and I, that there's a sort of alchemy between all these groups that we couldn't have engineered it. There's a great serendipity that came out of that, and we wanted to respect that in the design that we actually came up with. So we started hosting a series of small co-design workshops, and it quickly became apparent that we had access to a really remarkably committed and passionate group of people with some astonishing stories there was nothing there that was mundane or uninteresting. So it was a really great piece of curation by all those people involved. Next slide, please. One of the early insights that we did have was all of us within Carbon and our previous kind of work, we've been used to designing services and applications for millions of users. So it was quite a privilege to actually be able to design for dozens, and that meant there was a level of care, empathy and respect that actually became as important as our design approaches. As we co-designed and co-discovered a lot of that, we actually started feeling a really acute sense of responsibility that actually became central to the work. And that sort of manifested itself in the very direct, non-technological way in which we crafted the workshops. And we think that sort of removed a lot of the barriers that we'd have earlier on. But we did have to balance our needs to move the workshops forward and deliver some outcomes, but without prejudicing and without foregone conclusions and our own design biases. Next slide, please. So after each workshop, we take time to decompress and reflect on each finding, capturing as much material and conversation as we could, all the kind of informal stuff between the activities that we'd organised, and to look for patterns and connections, try and map and extract places, people, characters and times to formulate something that would help us form ideas that we could test in the next round of workshops. Next slide, please. That meant we used a lot of post-it notes, and if you kind of got a phobia about this whole morning is going to drive you nuts. I actually thought this was quite a common practice, but I've learned from the designer that we've been working with that it's really just Dean that really likes to use coloured post-it notes. I'm sure there's a more crafted way of doing this, but it was actually quite a tangible and human process for us, and I think that was part of the power of it, having a very low-tech, lo-fi, quite kind of paper craft, a kind of craft-based process. Next slide, thanks. So around early spring of this year, we started to reflect on what the smallest unit of the stories would be, the atoms or the DNA, if you like, and how they might be created, discovered, connected and shared. We started to think about the notion of story blocks, almost like Lego, that might be personal or archival media, abstractions like places, people, and the kind of tools that you might need to assemble these blocks into meaningful, coherent narratives. Next slide. So we arrived at the notion of a block being almost kind of a paragraph to which we can attach metadata and media that can either be from an institutional archive, the open web, or personal collections. And the metadata would help us form rich connections that might not be apparent in otherwise unconnected stories. And that actually kind of led back to the principles that we'd established early on, that where we wanted to see a tapestry emerge from all the conversations and stories that we helped kind of tease out of our community groups. Next slide. So far, our communities in Butte and Stoke have embraced the kind of metaphor of the blocks, and we've started to test that in recent weeks. And I say embrace, but actually they co-invented this with us. It wasn't something that we did in isolation. It's very much a collaborative process in the truest sense. And we're starting to move from using paper prototypes, as you saw earlier, to early very limited digital tools to see if we can actually transpose the stories that we've been hearing into a more electronic structure, and whether that honours the original narrative and allows it to inhabit a much more flexible digital platform. Next slide, thanks. So the next couple of slides, actually this is the first digital sketch, I guess, that we've put together. It's not very pretty, but it's allowing us to transpose what we're learning from the workshops into an electronic structure, and kind of move forward on maybe designing some concept visuals, which you can see in the next couple of slides. These are very, very early, but you can see, I think this screenshot represents a birth certificate that's been ingested as a potential story block, and how you can start orchestrating real life artifacts and representing people and characters within the stories. Next slide, please. I'm not quite sure that is. I think that's a bit of background video. But we were very careful to not try and design experiences too early, but actually let the conversations and interactions with community groups lead us to this point. And it's been a challenge in some respects, because we did detect frustration early on where we were trying to avoid saying what this was. We wanted that to kind of be discovered together, but it meant that it was going to be quite a lengthy process before we got to something that was a tangible kind of artifact. But I think in recent weeks, if I'm right, we've started to cross that divide. Next slide, thanks. So in the last few minutes, I want to reflect on a smaller but maybe just as vital perspective that we brought to the project, and that's kind of scouting and understanding wider implications and technologies, experiences that are out there. Staying abreast of the state-of-the-art in storytelling tools was one of the key activities for us. almost every day we're learning about some mobile application platform that was, storytelling has become a sort of metaphor, visual. And it actually meant that the principles that we'd established very early on helped to filter what might be useful out in the real world and what actually was just noise. And we've kind of, that's kind of led into the co-design process and meant that we can discard lots of stuff that might otherwise have distracted us very quickly. Next slide, please. And interesting, the public website, Pararchive.com, as it stands now, has become a really interesting corpus of knowledge about that kind of wider analysis of stuff. So we looked at some interesting innovations from Google, who are pulling together public data, their mapping tools, interesting kind of audio narratives to produce a little demo called Night Walk in Marseille. Probably not something that we could graft onto the conversations that we'd already had, but it helped us sort of see that some of our principles were correct to build something that was of the web rather than just on the web. Next slide, thanks. And actually, it also helped us cohere our thoughts about the projects that we did influence, one of which was Jonathan Harris's Cowbird project, which I think tonally seems to be quite close to what we wanted to do, and actually has a very sort of human set of values to it, which we wanted to try and replicate, but also not impose on the people that we've been working with today. Next slide, thank you. And we'd also kind of, we'd seen people at the New York Times really using some innovative formats and experiences to test out journalistic storytelling and what we could learn from that. And we found that although a lot of these experiences were very beautiful, we couldn't necessarily turn them into toolkits for other people to use. This was a very kind of production-heavy, large, very well-resourced operation, and we couldn't necessarily strap that into a set of handy tools that could be applicable to any kind of story. These were very specific in many cases. There's a kind of running joke that the snowfall demo on the top left there is something that everybody seems to talk about in the technology industry, but it's actually become a huge cliche as well for the kind of things that we didn't want to do. So we were very conscious early on that we wanted to avoid a very kind of gimmicky approach, but actually honour and respect the people that had started the project with us. And actually we've kind of come full circle. Rather than trying to build something that we could put out into a wider audience immediately, we wanted to create something that actually worked for the dozens of people that we were trying to assist initially, and if that translates into something that has a wider impact, fantastic, but we want to honour that group and respect their needs first. I think the next slide is my last one. So the last thing is, it's not really part of the design approach, but something that we did have to experiment with right at the beginning of the project was how do we actually create a kind of coherent set of tools across all the geographies that we're working in, the different cultures and communities. What are the kind of toolkits that we need internally to communicate and just help people catch up. Every group was moving at a different speed. The institutions that we're working with are kind of different levels of advancement in the projects, and we found that just a lightweight set of social tools was enough. So internally we use Basecamp just as a kind of catch-up tool and to organise discussions, but also kind of think out loud about stuff. For the stuff that Carbon does, we have another back channel using a tool called Slack, which means that we can bitch about everybody else without getting caught. But that's actually quite a useful outlet to kind of process a lot of our thoughts about things. And this was as much of an experimentation for us to understand what works for everybody. And is there one tool that fits everything? But I think maybe the most powerful thing was actually having a very public diary about what everybody was doing, which is Pararchive.com, and the public blog that you see. And that's been the more kind of curated, published and journalistic what we've been doing. And I think it's fair to say it kind of represents a lot of voices that are part of projects, or as much as we could. And then the last tool was really kind of building a small internal platform to test software sketches of ideas that we had. We just started to do that with community groups in the last few weeks. I think that's one thing. And the last one. It was a bit of a rushed journey through the design approach, but if you guys have got any questions, do feel free to jump in later.
I think we've got about 3 minutes for questions. Thank you.